opportunities to engage with you and the community. And so again, that will be communicated via the newsletter. And then we're going to wrap up. We'll get you out on time. Next slide, please. So Evermore is much broader than the work we do is much broader than what we're doing here today on the Lived Experience Bereavement Research Network. We do work within communities. We do work on science, kind of like this, but also the science of bereavement more broadly. And we also have done a lot of advocacy work. Many of you may know us because of the advocacy work that we've done. In fact, the ARC report is a result of congressional work that we did 3 years ago now, where we asked Congress to direct the ARC, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, to conduct a review of psychosocial interventions for bereavement. And they did. And so, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. And it also helps frame the work of LEBRN. Next slide, please. Our mission is to make the world a more livable place for all bereaved people. And we hope to do that in the end to achieve parity in health and prosperity in compared to our non-bereaved counterparts. Our work is really focused on accelerating systems change and lasting social change by using data and science to drive policy and practice change for all bereaved people in America. We are not a direct service organization. We do not provide therapeutic support. Rather, we look at the systems that support individuals and communities and how we can revise or enhance those systems so that the care that is delivered to you or for the first responders or the frontline providers as well is able to be the best that it can be. We follow 5 values in our organization pretty strongly, and they shape just about everything we do. We are looking to create just systems for all. We do recognize our differences, but we are always respectful. And that's very important, particularly when it comes to our advocacy work. We are always looking for the highest quality evidence in our decision-making, as evidenced by this ARC report. We are looking to innovate in the field of bereavement care, and we are hoping to continue to be a trustworthy partner for you and our other colleagues. Next slide, please. We have those 3 essential elements that I mentioned on the first slide, that we work through communities, we work with scientists, and we work in advocacy. And it is those 3 levers that we use together in order to create that structural change. Next slide, please. Evermore is actually a very unique entity in the space of the social entrepreneurship work we're doing. We're what's called a field catalyst. A field catalyst are organizations or efforts that only emerge when the social or environmental conditions demand them. And so an analogy that I use sometimes is it's similar to climate change activists in the 70s, when people are saying, what do you mean it's getting warmer outside, it's snowing? We are sort of on the very front lines pioneering systems change and bereavement policy, and have been doing this work for about a decade now. A lot of our work is coming to fruition, like in today's webinar. Next slide, please. The last thing that I'm going to say here, because some of the work, particularly at this early stage and sort of this field catalyst stage, it can be a little nuanced and technical. And so one of the frameworks that I use to think about our work is, imagine that we've all just landed on, or that we've just landed on a desert island. And, you know, we've got to get from one point of the island to the other point of the island. Today, the ARC report that you will hear about is the topography map of this island. It's kind of given us the lay of the land. And now there's a group of us, about 21 of us in total, who are working together inside the Lived Experience Bereavement Network, sort of the key advisors. And we're trying to go from one side of the island to the other side of the island. And again, we're having to navigate through the geography and, you know, the hills and the mountains and the valleys, which ARC is sort of starting to give us has given us some feedback as to sort of where are those mountains, where are those valleys. There are times where, just like sort of any reality show, we might have to call home to say, like, hey, are we actually on the right direction? We've come to this mountain, and should we go right or should we go left? And our conversations with you through these information sessions and town halls, as well as community conversations, future community conversations, which you'll learn more about in our newsletter, for example. Those are our opportunities to talk with you and try to understand, should we go right or should we go left? So today's conversation is to give an overview of the road we're trying to build from, A to Z, from one side of the island to the other. And then it's to review both the ARC report and the terrain, and then the PCORI work on this is how you build this road in order to get us to a future where the health and healthcare practices that people who come in our wake decades from now, years or decades from now, this work begins to alter how, when they present at their physician's office or in their clinic, when they say, I've recently lost someone significant in my life, there is a whole new protocol and practice that is executed as a result of the work that starts here. So really grateful for each of you being here today. We hope that we can continue the conversation. We can only build the road as good as the voices we hear. So it is very important to have you engaged. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Tom Weiser, who is leading the charge of getting us from one side of the island to the other.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Great. Let's go to the next slide. So Joelle's just been talking a little bit about our lived experience bereavement research network. And this slide shows our team, which is Joelle at the head and myself as the Director of Health Initiatives, Dominique Couture-Schurman, who is managing our health initiatives and trying to keep us organized. It's a tough job, but thank you, Dominique. And then Ellen and Lisa. Ellen Schultz and Lisa Stewart are two consultants who have vast PCORI experience, and they're helping us with this project as well and teaching us what we need to do to be successful. Next slide. Next slide, please. There we go. So this is the group that we're working with most closely. These are our advisory committee members, and some of you who are either working in research or maybe our care providers might recognize some of the names on this slide. We have 9 people who are part of the lived experience advisors. So these are people who are joining us because of their lived experience and trying to provide that sort of lens to see things with. We have 3 people who provide direct care for bereaved people. And then we have 6 people who are representing the researcher's point of view, a researcher's perspective in all of this. And we'll go to the next slide. So the next few slides will just show what this project is about and kind of walk through the timeline and the different pieces of this project. And I'll try and describe it as quickly as I can and as clearly as well. Next slide, please. So our goal is to gather a diverse network of people, including those with lived experience of bereavement, researchers and care providers, to inform the future of research by and for bereaved people. And we're doing this primarily by working with this advisory council that I just showed you in the previous slide, and then also by working to open up the discussion to the broader audience. Next slide, please. So this is a little graphic of our timeline. This shows that we had our first meeting with our advisors in April, and we met with each of the different subgroups separately first to get to know them and hear from them separately. But over the course of the next 2 years, we'll be meeting with all of them together for about a total of 7 meetings over the course of 2 years. Next slide. In addition to that, we have these 4 public town hall webinars, today being the very first one, and then we'll be doing 3 more of these over the course of the next 2 years. Next slide. So this is how it all looks put together, nice and neat. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So this project is really our effort to bring the voice of people who come from a background of having lived experience in bereavement or having worked closely or researched carefully in issues around bereavement. It's patient-centered, so we're representing the community of bereaved people, and we hope to build a foundation for the future of clinical effectiveness research, or CER, that's focused specifically on bereavement. This foundation that we want to build will be set on 2 pillars. One is engagement principles, and the second is research priorities. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. Next slide, please. So our first task during the year 1 of the project, that shaded part, will be to develop a set of engagement principles that are reflecting core values that we believe will help researchers to work successfully in partnership with bereaved people. These principles are primarily aimed at engaging bereaved people to be advisors, leaders, or co-investigators in future bereavement research. Now, there's a lot of work that's already been done to increase community engagement in research as participants, but this project is looking to go the next step and further engage bereaved persons to lead future research. Next slide. The second year is going to be really developing some research priorities. So we'll get together as a group, we'll brainstorm questions that we think should be tackled first from our perspective. And then we'll take these questions and we'll try and distill down to just 3 to 5. I'm sure we'll have a lot to begin with. And we'll format these questions in a specific way that's particular for carrying out patient-centered CER, using something called the PCORI framework. We'll incorporate population, intervention, comparators, time, and setting into these questions, so that as we formulate the questions, they'll be able to kind of hit on all those areas and make it a more effective question. Next slide. So we're taking maybe a mission impossible and turning it into a mission possible. And this is going to be a lot of work. We're going to have to do a lot of learning. Our members of our advisory council are going to have to learn new terminology, new concepts, new skills. And even though a lot of the folks on the advisory council already have research experience, we're going to have to work a little bit to make sure everyone is up to speed on how research is conducted so that we can formulate good questions. And then we're going to have to learn from experts in the field of CER to learn what is patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness research and what isn't CER. So that's going to be a learning curve for everyone, I think. And then we also want to make sure that we can kind of figure out how to tell our stories in a compelling way to make the case for why it's important not only to research bereavement, but to do it with bereaved people leading the way. And finally, we're counting on everyone's active involvement, the members of our advisory council and the public showing up for discussions like this one today, and providing leadership to set the foundation for the future of bereavement research. Next slide. So to help us in this work, we do have some guiding principles that Evermore uses across all of their projects and teams. And these include maintaining confidentiality in our meetings, making room for everyone to contribute to the discussion, speak about what is true for you, and listen with curiosity. Next slide. Keep in mind that together we know a lot. Be courageous and honest, assume the best in one another, trust in the positive intent and impact of each other's words and actions. So as we begin our discussion today, we hope everyone can abide by these principles. And we are really grateful that you're here with us today. And thank you for coming. Next slide. So I'll pause for a second just to see, has anything come up in the chat that we need to address? Or can we move on and introduce our next speaker?
So we have one question, Tom.
Okay. Yeah, I see that about compensating the advisory council members. And yes, for folks who have signed up who are serving as advisory council members, there is compensation built into the funding for this project. So their time will be compensated. Other questions, Joya?
There's another about will the copies of the slides be shared?
Yeah, I believe the copies of the slides as well as the recording will be available.
That is correct. We're going to have a follow-up email after this that will go out to everyone who joined us today, and it'll have a link to a couple of different items, including the slides and a recording of today's conversation.
Great. All right, so let's bring back up the slides. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sangeeta Aluwalia. She's the Associate Director of RAND Healthcare and a Senior Policy Researcher at RAND, who leads studies to improve access and quality of palliative care, as well as to enhance diagnostic safety across healthcare settings. Her palliative care research focuses on improving patient-provider communication, measuring patient experience of end-of-life care, and measuring quality of palliative care. She also conducts evidence synthesis research and is a core investigator for the Southern California Evidence Review Center. Dr. Aluwalia received her PhD in health policy from UC Berkeley and her MPH from the same place as I did at UCLA. So it's a real pleasure to have you join us today, Dr. Aluwalia. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Great. I always love seeing my headshot from about 15 years ago. It reminds me of a different time. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. So as Dr. Weiser mentioned, I work at RAND. I'm also a core researcher at the Southern California Evidence Review Center, which is where this project was conducted. I'm grateful to be able to talk to you about what we found. A little background on myself. My research is in the area of palliative care and end-of-life care. My dad was a hospice doctor, so I spent a lot of time in hospices and hospitals and ICUs, and I saw a lot of things that I was moved by and led me to this career. But mainly, I think I saw a lot of sadness and a lot of loss. I often wondered what had happened to those who had lost someone once they went back home, once they went back to their lives, and what help there was for them to continue in the land of the living. So today we'll talk a little bit about that specific topic. Next slide, please. Just as a quick disclaimer, our project was funded by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality within the Department of Health and Human Services. Anything I present today does not necessarily represent the official views of AHRQ or imply endorsement by AHRQ. Next slide. As Joelle mentioned, in 2023, Congress directed AHRQ through its Effective Healthcare Program to establish an evidence base for what constitutes high-quality bereavement and grief care. This systematic review eventually informed an independent subject matter expert panel, which then assessed the feasibility of developing consensus-based quality standards for high-quality bereavement and grief care. That panel was convened by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Also, throughout the project, we were further supported by a key partner in this space, the American Psychological Association. Next slide. So the Effective Healthcare Program at AHRQ seeks to improve the quality of healthcare by providing the best available evidence on outcomes, benefits and harms, the appropriateness of healthcare interventions and services. Their audience are healthcare professionals, patients, the public, and healthcare organizations, as well as policymakers, so that all of those individuals can make informed healthcare decisions. As part of the Effective Healthcare Program, ARC created evidence-based practice centers, or EPCs, you'll hear sometimes. The role of the EPCs is to conduct evidence syntheses and develop reports for ARC. There are currently 9 EPCs, of which mine is one. Each EPC is made up of medical and health services researchers that come from both clinical health backgrounds as well as scientific research backgrounds. Our EPC, like the others, conducts systematic reviews, scoping reviews, rapid reviews, other types of research synthesis. And our literature reviews inform clinicians, patients, and guideline groups in the development of best practices. So today I'm going to talk about our review of bereavement care conducted by our team. Next slide. The first question to really think about is, why was this review necessary to conduct in the first place? And to answer this, I think we must first consider what we already know about grief and bereavement. So we know that the death of someone is a universal human experience, and it is one of the most challenging experiences someone might go through in their lifetime. We also know that grief is unique to each bereaved individual. We also know that it is a non-cyclical experience. Most bereaved individuals experience loss and feelings of acute grief following the death, and they may need certain supports, typically without the need for what we would consider formal intervention. There is a small subset of bereaved individuals who develop more intense, prolonged grief with high levels of distress, significant functional impact that could last 12 months and sometimes beyond following the death. To facilitate the timely identification of people with this level of grief and to intervene appropriately, prolonged grief disorder, or PGD, has been introduced as a formal diagnosis in 2018. It exists in the ICD-11 manual, and later in 2022 it was added to the DSM-5. A lot of work has been conducted to establish what prolonged grief and prolonged grief disorder is, and to distinguish it from other forms and presentations of grieving, and to validate the diagnostic criteria for this prolonged grief disorder. So that's a little of what we already know. Next slide. So what do we not yet know about grief and bereavement? Well, quite a lot, actually. So here are some questions that we were interested in addressing. Should we be screening for grief and grief responses either at or before or right after bereavement? What purpose might such screening serve? For whom might it benefit the most? And really importantly, when is the right time to screen for grief and grief responses? In particular, should we be screening everybody, in other words, universally, for grief responses? And if we do, then what is the right time to do that? How often? Another area of uncertainty, do we have validated tools that can be used to accurately screen for prolonged grief disorder or risk of prolonged grief and other grief responses so that we might better and more appropriately intervene? And speaking of interventions, we generally probably know that there are various options for bereaved and grieving individuals, but little is known about the effectiveness and potential harms of these interventions. What is the optimal time to implement these interventions? To whom should we offer them? In what settings should they be offered? And who should provide them? Next slide. So evidence-based practice is really important to healthcare, particularly in today's world of near unlimited access to information from multiple sources. This is even more true for fields that are growing as fast as our field of grief and bereavement care is, both to ensure that research is answering the most important questions and addressing the most important gaps, as well as to support providers and policymakers know how to deploy the best resources and know how to focus their attention. Systematic reviews represent our best understanding of available evidence. So why do we look to systematic reviews to understand what evidence for this topic is? They are a standardized and very thorough approach to synthesizing all existing evidence. While they're very resource intensive, they're also very comprehensive. So typically we would search multiple sources with very comprehensive search strategies. Systematic reviews also assess the bias that is in individual studies and are able to assess study results independently from the original study authors. Systematic reviews may also include what we call a meta-analysis, essentially aggregating data across studies to obtain an objective summary of effect or impact of interventions. And we, in conducting systematic reviews, apply universally accepted and rigorously developed criteria to evaluate the quality of the overall evidence base. So we conducted a systematic review to answer some of the questions that I previously mentioned. Next slide. Oh, I apologize. It looks like there was a build on that slide. As I mentioned, we conducted the systematic review to synthesize available evidence to address some of the gaps I had mentioned. That includes effects of bereavement screening strategies, the diagnostic accuracy of tools to identify people at risk for prolonged grief, and treatment for bereaved individuals. So these were our main key questions. Our first question was, what is the effectiveness and harm of universal screening for bereavement and response to loss? Our second question was, what is the accuracy of tools with which to identify bereaved individuals at risk for grief disorder or with grief disorder? And then finally, our last question is broken up into two parts. What is the effectiveness, comparative effectiveness, and harms of interventions for people who are at risk for grief disorders related to bereavement, and also for people who are diagnosed with grief disorders related to bereavement? Next slide. This is a quick look at our review team, really just to note that we had a content expert. We always have a librarian, a statistician, and a medical editor. And then in particular, for this review, a large team of literature reviewers whose job was to look at each individual study and pull data from each of them. Next slide. We could have a whole course on systematic review methods, and of course there are whole courses on these methods. I'll just go through a few key highlights related to how we undertook this. As is vitally important to a rigorous and transparent review process, multiple stakeholders were engaged in informing this work, though ultimately the research and conclusions do not necessarily represent their views. This includes key informants. So in designing the study questions that I just showed you, our evidence center consulted several key informants who each represented different end users of the research that we were about to embark on. We also engaged a technical expert panel. So in designing the questions, as well as establishing the methodology at the outset of this report, our center consulted a large group of technical and content experts. We particularly looked to include broad expertise and perspectives because, especially in a systematic review, divergent and conflicting opinions are really important to inform results that are thoughtful and meaningful. Of course, we pulled from the literature. We looked at multiple sources for that literature from the inception of those databases all the way through June of 2024. So for example, for primary research studies, we looked at databases like PubMed or Medline, Embase and SynHall, which are databases that publish nursing-related research, PsycInfo, which publishes psychology-related research, social work databases. We also looked at clinical trials registries so we could capture any RCTs. We looked at databases that catalog other systematic reviews and similar types of evidence reviews. And we also looked at major clinical guidelines databases to see if there was any evidence there around grief and bereavement care guidelines. And then we regularly engaged our key informants or expert panel and our partners to identify either seminal studies that we missed or other databases that we needed to include. So I'm going to jump in the next slide to some of the highlights of what we found. Next slide, please. So we actually found a fair bit of research that ended up being included in our review, a total of 219 unique studies that were reported across 418 different publications. We definitely found more evidence in some areas than others. So for our question about universal screening, we found it included 9 unique studies. For our question about the accuracy of diagnostic and identification tools, we found 18 studies. And then for our question around the effectiveness of interventions for both individuals at risk for prolonged grief, as well as individuals who are already diagnosed with prolonged grief, we found a total of 192 unique studies. The majority of those studies, 189 of them, focused on individuals at risk for prolonged grief who did not yet have a formal clinical diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder. We did find 3 studies that specifically examined populations of individuals who had been clinically diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder, and those are included in these 192 total studies. So I'll go through some of the findings on the next slide. So for the screening question, which was, what is the effectiveness and harms of universal screening for bereavement and loss? We wanted to look at the evidence for specific outcomes of screening. And so our TEP helped us prioritize the outcomes we should focus on, which were immediate experience of the individual being screened. So those were things like just their overall experience with the screening process, feeling pathologized, feeling worried or stressed. We also looked at outcomes related to accuracy of the screening process, so correctly identifying people at risk for grief, prolonged grief, screening tools that were able to correctly predict grief responses 6 months after death. And then we also looked at impact, so things like underdiagnosis, overdiagnosis, appropriate treatment, delayed treatment, undertreatment, as another outcome. In our next slide, no studies actually evaluated a truly universal screening approach. So for example, assessing everybody for grief. That can be maybe because it is logistically challenging to do that in some cases. And there was a small body of evidence that then evaluated the impact of more targeted screening approaches for recently bereaved people. All of the studies reported at least one positive result of screening. So it was feasible, it was very acceptable to the people being screened, or they appropriately identified a higher risk group. But we did not find a study that evaluated impact, burden, timing, the best time to screen for bereavement in response to death, or the right population to screen for bereavement. There was across these studies, they were all very different. And so we were unable to sort of synthesize evidence to create overarching evidence statements on any of the outcomes that we were interested in. Next slide. So our next question was around how accurate are tools to identify bereaved individuals at risk for or with grief disorder. And so again, here we turn to the expert panel to help us prioritize the outcomes we wanted to look at. Those outcomes include things like diagnostic or predictive accuracy. So how sensitive was the tool at either predicting subsequent grief responses or prolonged grief or grief-related responses? We also looked at participant experience again, and then again at the impact of having one of these tools administered. And then on our next slide, We actually found some interesting results here. There was a body of evidence that reported good accuracy of one particular tool, the Inventory of Complicated Grief. There were other tools that were examined more on a individual or maybe a couple studies looked at it, including the PG-13, the Indicator of Bereavement Adaptation Cruise Scotland, which is the IBACS, and then the GEM, which was the Grief Evaluation Measure. And each of these studies also reported positive outcomes, mainly around accuracy. Important to note that accuracy in all these studies was based on health outcomes measured over time. So, for example, symptoms of depression that were measured at 6 months and 12 months, symptoms of grief, symptoms of trauma or PTSD. No studies applied the diagnostic criteria, either DSM or ICD, for grief disorder diagnosis as a reference standard to assess accuracy. That may reflect the relative newness of these diagnoses and a lag time in sort of incorporating it in diagnostic accuracy studies. I will move to the next slide. So then our last batch of evidence, which was the largest, was around interventions. So the effectiveness and harms of interventions for people at risk for grief disorders and for people who were diagnosed with grief disorders. So again, we had outcomes that were prioritized by the expert panel, and you can see here the full list. I do want to point out that there's a difference between how studies reported grief symptoms versus grief disorder symptoms. So grief symptoms, for the most part, studies looked at sort of more in a more acute phase, so in the first few months following a bereavement, and often looked at things like self-reported sadness, tearfulness, insomnia or difficulty sleeping, anger, denial. Studies that specifically articulated that they were looking at grief disorder symptoms added a time component. So in line with the prolonged grief disorder criteria, looking at 12 months or longer after bereavement for adults, 6 months for loss of for kids and teens, and looked at specific symptoms such as intense yearning or longing for the deceased individual, preoccupation with thoughts or memories that occurred most days and impacted daily life, again, self-reported, intense emotional pain, identity disruption, emotional numbness, inability to experience positive mood, and difficulty reintegrating into relationships and activities. Again, looking at that time component of, for adults, 12 months or beyond. So that was the distinction between those two, grief symptoms and grief disorder symptoms. So on the next slide, one thing to highlight here is that we found a wide range of interventions described in the literature, which I think is great. It's really indicative of a substantial body of evidence. So you can see psychotherapy, pharmacotherapy, expert facilitated support groups, as well as peer support groups, self-help interventions. We didn't find any interventions pertaining to spiritual counseling in the literature. And then we found a group of interventions that we sort of bucketed into this other category. So music and art and writing therapy was one. Comprehensive provider support usually was a interdisciplinary team intervention. And then integrative medicine or complementary and alternative medicine interventions. In the next slide, we can see some of the key findings. So there was reasonable strength of evidence for the beneficial effect of psychotherapy, specifically on the outcomes of grief disorder symptoms, grief symptoms, and depression symptoms. We also found moderate evidence for the beneficial effect of expert facilitated support groups, again, on grief symptoms and on depression symptoms. We did not find enough evidence to say anything about the effect of peer support groups or self-help interventions, and also of the other category, in part because of how disparate each of those studies were. One thing that's not on this slide, and that was an oversight in my editing of the deck, there were 3 studies, as I mentioned earlier, that specifically looked at interventions for patients diagnosed with grief disorders that were included in our review. They all reported psychotherapeutic interventions. 2 were randomized controlled trials, and the third was a quasi-experimental study. All of them found benefit of the psychotherapeutic intervention. So one was a multimedia psychotherapy intervention that showed improvement in grief symptoms. Another was CBT, which showed improvements in depression and PTSD symptoms. And then the third was a narrative reconstruction psychotherapy intervention. This one showed a little bit of improvement on depression symptoms that wasn't statistically significant, likely because it was a very small sample size, did show improvement on grief disorder symptoms. So definitely promise in the psychotherapeutic interventions for patients diagnosed with grief disorders. There were 4 RCTs that looked at pharmacotherapy. They all looked at different medications and different outcomes. They all showed some benefit on grief symptoms and depression symptoms, but all except one were combined with a psychological intervention, so CBT or other types of psychotherapy. So it is a little hard from these 4 RCTs to disentangle the effect of the medication from the psychotherapy. I see some questions popping up. I'm almost through these slides, and then we can turn to the questions. If we could go to the next slide, I just have a few more to go. Just highlight some of the limitations of this review. One that I think is really important is we restricted to studies that were published in English, mainly to ensure the applicability of the evidence to any potential US practice recommendations. This may have missed tools and interventions that are available in other cultures, and I'm sure everyone in this group understands the importance and need for culturally sensitive and culturally tailored appropriate bereavement care. Interestingly, we found very little information in the studies we did include on cultural considerations. So it was an area that was not really touched on in the studies that are included in our review. Another limitation is that the populations across our studies were very heterogeneous, and they were not always representative of what we would think of as routine practice. And so there are some applicability limitations to our findings. And then interestingly, though we only looked at studies that were published in English, a lot of the studies actually took place in non-US settings. Certainly they may have been English-speaking settings, but they were non-US settings. So we can accept that there's some generalizability of the grief and bereavement experience across US and non-US populations. But intervention and screening is likely implemented very differently in the US versus non-US health settings, as well as in community settings. And so that's another limitation or caveat to consider the results within. Next slide. So some key takeaways. I think that the review addressed some, probably not all of the key questions facing the field currently. It illuminates some pathways for future research to help move the field forward and closer to evidence-based standards of bereavement care. In the next slide, I want to reinforce that there was a substantial evidence base. There was 219 studies, which is quite a lot. And there is some support for some of the interventions described in the literature. In particular, we found a large body of literature that described interventions for people at risk for grief disorder that highlight the different kinds of options available to support bereaved and grieving individuals, regardless of whether they are formally diagnosed with a clinical disorder. In particular, there was moderate strength of evidence for psychotherapy and expert facilitated support groups on some outcomes. And in the next slide, while we did discover a large body of evidence, there was a lot that we were surprised to find did not exist in the literature. For example, there was very little information on subgroups. So one of the main questions that I presented earlier was, for whom, what subgroups of people might screening or even interventions be appropriate for? What is the right time? What about the differences in the different kinds of deaths that occur, traumatic versus non-traumatic, for example? And how does that impact the effectiveness of interventions for bereaved individuals? There's just not enough information in the literature to say, to create evidence statements that kind of synthesize what we know to answer those questions. The other thing that was surprising is we couldn't find much about the impact of interventions like peer support groups. Peer support groups, there's a growing body of evidence in other areas of health and social care. And they are a really feasible and desired approach to receiving support by members in the community. And so it seems like a promising avenue for bereavement care, but there just wasn't enough evidence for peer support groups yet. And then we talked about some of the outcomes that we focused on when we presented our results, but we also looked at a very long list of outcomes that our key informants and expert panel thought were meaningful. And most studies did not address those outcomes. They tended to address things that are easier to quantify in a research study, like symptomatology, which is also very important and impactful. But there's probably room to expand our view of what outcomes we want to pay attention to. And then we found no evidence on potential unintended consequences of intervening, whether it's, for example, screening at the wrong time or screening or intervening in a certain way. So I'm going to pause there. I felt like I distilled a lot of information into a few slides and still feel like I probably could have distilled a little bit more. But in our next, I think I just have a last slide, which is essentially questions. And I will try and let me just move my screens around so I can see some of the questions.
Thank you, Sangeeta. That was amazing. There are a lot of questions in the chat, so I don't have to pull one of my questions out of my back pocket. A number of them do kind of seem to coalesce around the idea of context, which you did speak about towards the end, the lack of evidence for different types of losses and different types of contexts, even though that's so important for people's experience of bereavement. Is there anything more that you'd like to say about that, first off?
About the lack of evidence for specific contexts.
Right, or suggestions that maybe might lead us to get evidence for that.
Yeah, I hate to say this, but I'm a researcher, and so it's no surprise that all my studies end with more research should be done. But I will say that in this case, it really, and actually this is true of reviews I've done more broadly about end of life issues, is there really is a wide open landscape to enhance our understanding of what is a very complex process that we just don't, our systems don't address adequately enough, and that we don't talk about regularly enough. And so there is a lot, it seems maybe to everyone here as well, that it would be reasonable for us to think about stratifying the way we intervene, the way we identify individuals who could benefit from intervention by certain characteristics because of how unique the grieving process is. And yet that evidence doesn't exist. I think a lot of the reason the evidence doesn't exist is because funding for this topic is hard to come by. And so, there is a need to sort of look at what is doable in a research study first and sort of lay the basics down, and then build your case for it. And now we need to expand the research questions and the way we approach this to be really meaningful to people like us. And I think that's where the field has been moving. But it seems like we have a long way, not a long way to go, but a sort of, again, there's a wide open landscape. I see some of the questions here, if this is okay, Dr. Weiser.
Yeah, if you can see them, that's great.
Because I think they kind of get to the same thing. So in no particular order, I see a question about lack of evidence for peer support groups. It's really because of both. The studies that have been done are showing unclear benefit. And then there aren't enough studies to adequately synthesize what we do know. The other challenge with studying peer support groups that has come up in other arenas is that peer support groups are run quite variably. And so to be able to say, this is what a peer support group is, this is the dose, and this is the effect of this intervention is much harder than certainly if you take, a medication, right? That's on the other end of the continuum. So as you go from a medication to different types of health services interventions to something in the community that is variably structured, it gets a lot harder to demonstrate evidence for it. So that's one. And then I do want to address Aaron's question. I think the question was referring to the 3 studies that we found that were focused on psychotherapy. Those particular 3 studies were for people who met prolonged grief disorder criteria. So they were diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder per the DSM criteria. And 2 were a randomized controlled trial, which is the highest level, right, of its gold standard evidence. And the 3rd was a quasi-experimental, which is sort of the next level. So it is solid evidence for at least across 3 studies, which is not a lot, effectiveness of psychotherapeutic intervention for people who meet prolonged grief disorder criteria. Their psychotherapeutic interventions, though, were each different across the three studies. One was CBT. And then I saw something else at the high quality evidence. So in general, this is sort of like I'm forgetting the phrase. Okay, this is happening to me a lot where like I know this word exists and I can't think of it, but it's almost like chicken and egg, but it's not, that's not the phrase I'm looking for. High quality evidence tends to be, high quality care is care that is grounded in high quality evidence. And so high quality care is one in which we know that based on, let's say, a lot of randomized controlled trials, that this particular intervention will lead to this particular outcome. That is what high quality care is. Again, on this continuum, it is hard to get to that standard for something that has so much multidimensionality in the experience and so much multidimensionality in how interventions are received and sort of processed and the outcome that it can achieve. But I think the goal is to get close to that model. Okay, and then could you please share what are the benefits and drawbacks of relying on the DSM codified prolonged grief disorder 6 to 12 months? Some people, yes. So what we looked for was whether studies who, for example, were looking at a particular screening tool or a identification tool or even an intervention, whether the study measured and reported if their participants had any type of reaction to being intervened on. And one of those reactions could have been that they felt they were being pathologized or they felt they were being minimized or whatever that experience was. This was not systematically assessed across studies in a way that we can say this intervention does lead to this unintended consequence of people feeling like they were pathologized. So the literature doesn't point to this. There's not enough there being measured to assess whether that is a reasonable concern or not, or not a reasonable concern. It is a reasonable concern, but a evidentiary concern. And the 6 to 12 months. So I really appreciate this question. I will say that I'm not a grief and bereavement practitioner, and I myself do not do the development of interventions or tools in this space, nor have I been involved with the sort of development of the DSM criteria. And so with my researcher hat, I'm really not able to comment on, whether that's an appropriate cutoff or not. And then, so we did not find, there was a question about whether there's been research on EMDR. We did not find in our included studies EMDR as an intervention. It would have fallen into the other category unless it was paired with a psychotherapeutic intervention. I can certainly go back and check just to make sure there wasn't like a one-off study that included it, but we overall did not find anything that allowed us to say anything about EMDR, which is a really great question. Yeah, okay, yes. And so I'll just answer these last two questions. Stephanie sent a separate message, so I apologize, but we found very little in the literature that looked at that answered our research questions, but stratified by particular kind of loss in a way that would allow us to synthesize information. So, for example, is there a difference between when you lose a parent versus lose a child? There's a lot of, I think, research on what the trajectory of bereavement and grieving looks like based on or stratified by different kinds of loss, and a lot of information that looks at what the impact is based on type of loss. We did not have a research question that looked at that in particular. We were looking at interventions, and there is insufficient evidence and heterogeneous information about the impacts of either screening or actual therapeutic interventions stratified by kind of loss. And I think that's a really glaring gap in the literature or in our in the availability of evidence that we have at hand. I guess I'll pause there because I know I'm sort of at my time. I apologize for going over, but I know that in the chat, there's a link to the full report. The report is very dense. Every time I look at it, like my stomach sinks a little bit because there's a lot of words in that report. If someone has a question, please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to answer more questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Sangeeta. I know Joelle had one other thing she wanted to follow up with. So Joelle, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just mention two things. There was a question about what defined high quality. And one way that I think about it in my mind is that if we were going to turn to the taxpayers, and again, people are really stretched for every penny, would we say, if you gave us these pennies, we are absolutely confident that we'd have this outcome? And so it's sort of a different way of looking at the construct of saying, okay, we know with very, very high level of confidence that your pennies will be appropriately applied in this sense. And so, when I read the ARC report, and to Sangeeta's point, there's a lot of work to do. And we haven't yet gotten to the point where we can confidently say to someone who is putting, penny to penny aside to pay for food and for care, and that we're not yet to a point where we can say we can appropriately apply those pennies to help offset the course, the downhill course for people in the aftermath. And that's a place where I think we should get to. And I think a lot of other questions that came up in this chat, and something that we talk about internally a lot, as well as with the network, and then again in community conversations, is this sort of dynamic of the increasing medicalization of a common human experience. And so, as we look at our work as an organization and we look at the systems around the individual, how can we reorient those systems in such a way to be supportive? To, to any form of loss for whatever the period of time is, so that we're not creating cumulative hardship onto individuals. And maybe over time, we're going to have interventions that are absolutely worthy of those pennies because they're going to have such broad population level impacts. Um, you're welcome. The other thing I'll say about the federal funding, so everything is always unpredictable in DC. Who knows? That being said, we are continuing to do our work, and we have always worked with both sides of the aisle. We are continuing to have conversations with both sides of the aisle. We had we've had conversations with this White House. They've reached out to us on a couple of things. We had conversations with the last White House. We're going to continue to do that work. We're continuing to look at this from a population level concern. Again, going back to how do we organize and structure the systems around an individual so that that cumulative hardship is just not so heavy that people are struggling to cope and adapt to a really profound loss, but then also, being asked or being challenged with work, being challenged with financial obligations, and so on and so on and so on. So who's to say? But we are going to keep, trying to get the ball down the field, again, with everyone here, because it's going to take, we're looking, as I said at the top, on the values, we're looking to create just systems for everybody. And it can be a delicate balance sometimes, but at the end of the day, that's what we need. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Sangeeta. It's really wonderful
Thank you for
to
having
have
me.
your brain looking at all of this. Is just such sweeping work that had to be done in order to even get this all organized. And really look forward to continuing to work with you maybe in the future as we chart where are the most significant, bangs for our pennies.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
it's a great next step. Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. I really appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Let's bring up the slides and we'll introduce Michelle. So Michelle Johnston Fleece is our next presenter. She's the Associate Director of Workforce Development at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI. In prior PCORI roles, she was a Senior Program Officer and an Engagement Officer focused on advancing the science of engagement. She has worked to advance person-centered healthcare for nearly 20 years and has worked in various stakeholder contexts. Michelle's work is inspired by lived experience as the caregiver for her husband, Matthew, who died in 2004. She holds an MPH from Rutgers School of Public Health and received her bachelor's degree from New York University. Michelle, thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Joyal, and thank you all for being here today. You can go to the next slide. As Tom said, my name is Michelle Johnston Fleece. I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about PCORI, as well as a bit about my own personal experience with grief and bereavement, and my path to engagement in healthcare and research as a person with lived experience. Next slide. To that end, this is what I'll cover today. I'll start with a bit about me, my background, and my personal and professional trajectories. I'll then provide some background on PCORI, and that includes, the type of research we fund and how we work. And specifically, I'll focus on our mission and approach to funding research, engagement in research and what that looks like, and why PCORI emphasizes involvement of all impacted communities in our work. And then I'll provide a very brief summary of PCORI funded work on grief and bereavement. Next slide, please. So again, about me and my background. Next slide. This is me looking quite young, and I am there with my husband, Matthew. So my experience with Matthew was a foundational experience in my life and influenced everything that came after, including my current career. So in brief, he received a cancer diagnosis about a year after we met, and he was in continuous treatment for about 5 years before he died in 2004. So on the slide on the right, I outline a few key features of my bereavement experience that touches on a number of the issues Joyal just talked about and how it impacted me. So that includes, I had to leave a first career to find a supportive work environment while he was sick and got sicker. And eventually I had to quit work altogether to care for him at the end of his life. I'll talk more about it, but in brief, this had a long-lasting impact, as you can imagine, on my career trajectory and finances. The experience also left me very socially isolated at the time. I had no peers with a similar, going through a similar experience. In fact, they're only now beginning to catch up, and this is almost 21 years later, as they're beginning to experience more illness and death in their families. In addition, we had to move to another city to care for him, but also for some family support, which left me even more socially isolated as I left my community in New York City, where I had gone to college, lived for 10 years, and had started my career. The financial impacts, as I noted, were significant. I already mentioned having to leave my budding career and eventually quit work. But also, he had no life insurance due to his illness. So when he died, there was no life insurance money. I received a grand total of $255 from Social Security as a death benefit. Due to my age, I was too young to receive or inherit his Social Security payments. And because we didn't have children, if we did have children, there would have been Social Security money to support the children. But because we did not, $255 is all I received. And I actually only in researching for this presentation learned that that amount for the death benefit has not changed since 1954. So in terms of my mental health, I did a free bereavement support group through a nonprofit. That was a professionally led group, as Sangeeta mentioned. And then I went into individual therapy once I got back to work and got health insurance. I then started from scratch, went back to graduate school, got a master in public health with a goal to improve healthcare. And with time and rebuilding community, I was also able to rebuild other aspects of my life. Next slide. So this is what it looks like in terms of the timeline and how I personally made my way from a person with lived experience into healthcare and research space and eventually finding my way to PCORI. So as I mentioned, I had a first career that was actually in television as an associate producer in television. When he was diagnosed in the year 2000, it became necessary to change careers. That job is freelance. There was no job security or benefits, and it really was not a lifestyle that was conducive to caregiving for someone who was sick. So I made a transition into nonprofits that same year. When he died in 2004, I went back to graduate school. I had to do that while working full-time due to the financial pressures I mentioned. And also began doing some volunteering in cancer advocacy, which included both policy advocacy, but also in cancer support. And I even wrote a magazine column about caregiving for about 3 years. So I was sort of working kind of as a volunteer in the space while also getting my degree and doing my training. A couple of years after I received my master in public health and began working in health policy, the Affordable Care Act passed, which among many other things, so that passed in 2010, among many other things the law did, it emphasized a focus on patient-centeredness in healthcare and also authorized PCORI. So during this time, I carved a niche in involving patients and families in healthcare delivery and healthcare policy through work at a number of organizations, including the American Board of Internal Medicine, which is a physician certifying organization, a local health system in Philadelphia, as well as Cancer Support Community, which is a nonprofit that provides support for people living with cancer and their family members, as well as they do advocacy as well. By 2012, PCORI issued its first research award and really was at the forefront of supporting patient and stakeholder involvement in research at a large scale. So I was lucky enough to get a job with PCORI in 2014 and moved to DC when I got that job. You'll see there's a little logo there. I did move over to the National Academy of Medicine for a few years to focus on patient-centered healthcare more broadly, but then came back to PCORI almost 7 years ago now. So over the years, I've also done a lot of volunteering, as I mentioned, and advisory work around patient and stakeholder engagement and varied healthcare activities and organizations. And finally, in the last few years, I've actually become more involved in volunteering for an organization that provides support for people experiencing grief and trauma. Next slide. So with that background on me, I'll transition into talking more about PCORI and how we work, as well as what we fund. So I'll start by sharing our straightforward charge, and that is to provide information to help people make informed healthcare decisions. We do this by producing and promoting high integrity, evidence-based information from research that is guided by patients, caregivers, and the broader healthcare community. Next slide. To meet our mission, PCORI funds patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness research, or CER for short. CER compares the benefits and potential harms of different healthcare options to provide evidence that patients and other healthcare decision makers can use to make informed choices about which options best meet their individual needs and preferences. CER is vital in today's healthcare landscape because we have an ever-increasing number of effective care options for many conditions, and too often people face choices without adequate information to help them weigh the trade-offs of their options or make informed decisions for themselves or their families. So PCORI's unique place in the health research landscape stems from our focus on patients and their outcomes. We're widely recognized as a leader in driving US clinical research to be more patient-centered, which results in evidence that is more relevant and useful. And PCORI emphasizes the engagement or involvement of patients, caregivers, and the broader healthcare community in all aspects of our research, as well as the dissemination and uptake of findings. So next slide. And because I know it can be a somewhat complex concept, I want to dig a little deeper into what specifically we mean when we say patient-centered CER. As I noted, comparative clinical effectiveness research compares benefits and harms of two or more treatments, clinical or care delivery strategies, or other approaches to healthcare that are currently in use in clinical practice. So that is something that is a key point that we'll talk a bit about more. These are about comparing treatments that are currently in use in clinical practice. So patient-centered CER focuses on outcomes that are important to patients and other stakeholders. It measures benefits in real-world populations. It describes results in subgroups of people. So these points speak to some of the questions we got that Sangeeta got. And all told, patient-centered CER seeks to help consumers, clinicians, purchasers, and policymakers all make informed decisions to improve health care for individuals and populations. So to clarify where CER fits into the larger research continuum, it means that CER comes into play after the discovery and development research that introduces new preventive, diagnostic, and therapeutic options. CER generates evidence that helps decision makers evaluate options and make choices best suited to their needs and preferences. And to do so, PCORI-funded CER studies focus on real-world populations, unlike efficacy trials, which tend to recruit participants with narrower inclusion and exclusion criteria. So we're really looking to do studies that really, have study populations that look like the actual population of the United States, so that we're working with real-world evidence. Next slide. And with background on what patient-centered CER is and what PCORI funds, I want to also point out what we do not fund. So consistent with our authorizing law, PCORI does not fund research whose findings will include coverage recommendations, payment or policy recommendations, creation of clinical practice guidelines or clinical pathways, establishment of efficacy for a new treatment, pharmacodynamics or the study of the physiologic and molecular effects of drugs on the body, the study of a natural history of disease, or basic science or the study of biological mechanisms. Next slide. In terms of how we put this into practice, PCORI's work focuses in 4 areas. The first 3 are listed here: funding of patient-centered CER, which I've discussed, and funding of dissemination and implementation, making the results of PCORI-funded studies easily accessible and usable by those who need them to make better informed decisions. Funding engagement and research, so actively involving patients, clinicians, health systems, policymakers, and others as partners across the continuum of our work, from research topic selection to disseminating and implementing results, and ensuring that the research findings are useful and relevant for those we serve across the nation. Next slide. We also have programs that fund research infrastructure through initiatives like PCORNet. PCORNet is a network of clinical research networks that enhances the capacity to conduct patient-centered CER more efficiently on a national scale. So PCORNet Clinical Research Networks, or CRNs for short, are groups of diverse healthcare institutions from across the country, from large academic health centers to local community clinics. With more than 13,000 participating clinical sites and more than 47 million patients included, PCORNet is comparable to the nation demographically. These research networks work to capture complete healthcare data on their patient population. That primarily includes electronic health record data from both outpatient and inpatient care, and to a lesser extent, maybe claims information or other records that represent care received outside of the healthcare delivery system. PCORNet is open to everyone. We encourage investigators, other funders, patient groups, and health systems to explore PCORNet and consider it a possible platform to further research studies. Next slide. I'll transition next into talking a bit more about PCORI's commitment to engagement in research. Next slide. Engagement in research is about creating active partnerships between researchers and those most impacted by healthcare. So again, patients, caregivers, clinicians, and other partners. These partners contribute throughout the entire research process, from planning the study to conducting the study and sharing the results. And this engagement approach is fundamental to our mission to fund CER that helps people make better informed health decisions. Next slide. Engagement is one of the key pillars upon which PCORI operates, and it's integral to our work and the work of others that we support. So this slide shows how we operationalize our focus on engagement as an organization. We believe patients and stakeholders from across the entire healthcare enterprise should be actively and meaningfully involved throughout the entire research process. So as you see from the left, that goes from building research partnerships and capacity, which is exactly what this award with Evermore is doing, this project, through the development of research priorities, all through the conduct of research, and all the way to the review and dissemination and implementation of research findings. Next slide. Over the last decade plus of PCORI's existence, we've both studied and observed engagement in practice. And this slide has a summary of some important findings about engagement. So first, engagement works across all research phases, and it can involve many types of partners. It shapes how studies are designed and conducted, making them more relevant and feasible. And we found that partner involvement evolves naturally throughout a study and benefits everyone involved, from individual participants to entire communities. Our approach is helping transform research culture, though challenges do remain. Those challenges include resource limitations, dynamics among teams that are coming from very different lived experience and perspectives and even disciplines, organizational policies, and balancing, again, as I noted, different perspectives on a particular study. So while we've made significant progress, we continue to study how engagement can be more effective and inclusive, and we develop resources as well to support teams in working together. Next slide. And our experience with hundreds of research projects has shown a clear value and benefit to engaging patients and other partners in research. And the engagement enhances studies in multiple ways, again, making them more feasible, improving their quality, and increasingly the likelihood that the findings will actually be used in practice. Through these partnerships, researchers gain deeper insights into patients' lives and the reality of the clinical reality of their conditions. At the same time, patient partners develop new skills, make meaningful contributions, and often see improvements in their own health. When partners are genuinely included in decision making, the resulting relationships strengthen both research institutions and communities. And the collaborative approach creates research that is more relevant and ultimately more useful to improving healthcare. Next slide. In the context of a research study, meaningful engagement is really an active partnership throughout the entire process. So engagement occurs along a continuum ranging, as you move on this slide, from left to right, from input to consultation to collaboration and shared leadership. As you see with the arrow at the top, the level of partner decision-making authority for study design and implementation increases as you move to the right. So for PCORI funding, engagement practices that are limited only to activities that request input, such as conducting surveys or focus groups, would not be considered meaningful engagement. And we really look to see approaches in the studies we fund that involve a more meaningful engagement at moving to the right of the continuum. Next slide. To help refine engagement activities of research teams, PCORI developed the foundational expectations for partnerships in research, which provide the building blocks for meaningful engagement by translating the concept of engagement into concrete actions to help teams refine their engagement plans and activities. While each expectation stands alone, they work together as an interconnected system, helping teams create meaningful and lasting partnerships. These expectations aren't rigid rules, they're guidelines that adapt to a project's specific goals and team members' needs. For instance, when you plan for early partner engagement, you'll naturally develop practices that strengthen team collaboration. And building on the experience and evidence of PCORI awardees, the foundational expectations help project teams in maximizing partner contributions throughout all project phases to achieve goals and outcomes, facilitating engagement discussions and planning for patient-centered CER, proactively identifying and addressing potential challenges, and utilizing and enhancing team member strengths and assets. Next slide. And finally, I'll provide just a brief snapshot of some of PCORI's funded work related to grief and bereavement. Next slide. In reviewing our portfolio of funded projects, I found that PCORI has funded 10 research awards with a concrete connection to grief and bereavement. Most of the 10 track grief or bereavement as a study outcome, whether it's a primary or a secondary outcome. 2 of them use interviews or focus groups with bereaved people in order to adapt an intervention in the course of the study. And 1 study that's currently in progress is focused on comparing interventions to support parents or legal guardians after a child's unexpected or traumatic death. We have funded 1 implementation award. This award is implementing findings from a previously funded research award and is focused on expanding the use of team-based palliative care program that has been shown to improve quality of life for patients with Parkinson's disease. And we've also funded 3 engagement awards. 2 of these awards supported perinatal bereavement conference activities. And this 3rd award is the project we're all here talking about today with Evermore, titled Accelerating the Bereavement Field Toward Patient-Centered CER. Next slide. So in closing, I wanted to provide just a couple thoughts. That partnership of the bereaved, care providers, and researchers is really critical to developing research on bereavement. And that research is necessary to ensure that both healthcare and policy meet the needs of the bereaved. Building capacity for all who are involved in bereavement care is very important to meeting the challenge, which is what Evermore is doing with this project. And finally, I will say from my own personal experience, but also from PCORI, lived experience is both legitimate and valuable expertise. This point is worth repeating. You are an expert on your experience and needs, and we need that experience to advance our work as PCORI and for Evermore to advance its work as well in this space. So I thank you for the time today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that presentation. It really sets the stage for folks to understand just what PCORI is, what it funds, and understanding a little bit more about comparative effectiveness research. We have some questions in the chat. And I don't know if you can see the chat
I
yourself.
can pull it open. I did not keep an eye on it while talking, but I can take a look
No, no,
now.
I don't expect you to. But there's one that came from Heidi, and I think she had to sign off, but she's going to watch the recording to see how you answer it. She says, if CER focuses on interventions already developed or identified in healthcare practice, does this exclude interventions or supports within communities that are not recognized by the healthcare system, including culturally based processes, rituals, and supports? If that's the case, what may be lost in terms of our understanding of what supports people and gives them meaning?
Yeah, so I think this ties into some of what Sangeeta talked about. PCORI funds or compares approaches, whether they be medications or treatments or systems of treatment. That does not necessarily exclude community-based approaches or interventions. We have a whole program focused on systems, CER, meaning looking at approaches to care. But we do fund uh, interventions that have a basis of efficacy. Now, that said, we do also have, so that means if there's an intervention out there that does not have an evidence base, that would be trickier. And I realize, again, to Sangeeta's point, it can be trickier to get that evidence base for community-based interventions due to a number of reasons. However, we do fund those types of projects comparing those types of interventions. I will note that some of the ways we are able to do that is, again, we fund projects that, or we consider the following factors in sort of when we think about funding a CER project. That includes variations in the prevalence and burden of a condition, the evidence gaps in clinical outcomes, and practice variations that are occurring, and the potential relevance to prevention, diagnosis, treatment, monitoring, or management of health. So we can look a little beyond healthcare to health in some of these ways. We also, as part of our priorities, include a national priority called increasing evidence for existing interventions and emerging innovations in health. That also allows us to look at interventions that either have a basis of efficacy or are already in widespread use. So if a project is proposed where there is a treatment that may not have research behind it as being effective, but the case can be made that this is an intervention that is already in use in healthcare and being utilized with patients, that is something we could consider as for funding as part of a PCORI award.
So do you think that maybe like peer support groups could be included in something like that? Because there are tons of those around the country. And Sangeeta did mention that there's a lot of variability in how they're conducted. But if there were some that were more homogeneous, perhaps that could be used.
Yeah, and I should start by saying I myself am not a researcher. So I don't have the researcher hat to put on, but I would say again, an argument to be made for interventions that are in widespread use. I think if you're going to do a comparative project, we'd have to understand the interventions that are well described and fidelity to that intervention so that it can be compared with another treatment or intervention is generally what we're looking for. And I would say if anyone is thinking about particular project ideas for CER, our staff is very available. We do have a page on our website that lists all of the ways to contact staff at PCORI. They look like general email addresses because they are, but I can guarantee you we answer them. We do respond. We get on the phone with folks who are thinking about project ideas to provide what guidance we can in advance of submitting a letter of interest or an application so that you're able to kind of bounce ideas off us to get a sense of whether it's appropriate for a PCORI award or not.
Great, thank you. And Dominic just put in several links to PCORI in the chat, so that's how you can reach out to them. There's another question here from Natalie O'Brien. She asks, how does PCORI-supported research include individuals who have experienced traumatic loss, such as suicide or homicide, given that many are not connected to a healthcare setting at the time of death? For example, research shows that suicide loss survivors often do not seek treatment until several years after the loss, if at all. How might PCORI address this gap and support outreach or screening in non-clinical settings to better engage these populations?
I think for that, again, kind of going back to some of what Sangeeta talked about in developing sort of evidence around some of these interventions and screening tools, or utilizing screening tools that are effective. We fund real world research, meaning it is completely in bounds for PCORI to fund a CER award that involves, as one intervention, a community-based intervention. If the ultimate goal is to improve health or healthcare, that is within bounds. But the approach, like I said, needs to be in widespread use or have a level of efficacy involved.
Great. And we have another one that just popped up. Given that there is already a lack of professional support available, which has been made worse by the changing hospice landscape of mergers and acquisitions, how do we create systems for those who can't find, can't afford, or can't get to said professional support? Sounds like more of a question for Joyal and advocacy and policy.
I was going to say, you're going to be hearing from Michelle, the individual.
I'm
not sure I can adequately answer the question, but
yeah, or you can take off your PCORI hat and just answer as Michelle's experience.
I mean, I told you from my experience that it's not an easy answer, right? I mean, my husband did receive hospice care at home. So I was a primary caregiver through his death, did get some bereavement support from a social worker. It's very minimal through the hospice. And again, I sought out actually two different bereavement groups, found one that I felt worked for me, that were offered through nonprofits that were free. I had just turned 28 when my husband died. So again, financial issues, I did not have money for seeking out private services at that time. Nor again, I didn't have a lot of tools at the time either to really seek this out. I do think we need to make this care much more accessible. It's part of why on a personal front, I have gotten into this work as a volunteer, because I do see how critical it is to provide support. Again, I think Joyal can talk a lot about this as well, but in my former hat of working in health policy, sort of ensuring we have wearing my hat as a public health person, right? How can we set up additional social supports and other societal supports for people who are bereaved? People where they live, work, and play, right? People are at work. We need better organizational policies. We need better, leave policies that accommodate people who are bereaved. There are a number of interventions and other, public health, I think, issues to address when we're talking about the needs of the bereaved. But I think Joyal will have a lot more to say there.
Yeah. Go ahead, Joyal.
Yeah. So I think it's a fantastic question, and frankly, not just limited to hospice. Hospice is, 2/3 of hospice is now private equity driven. And so, even beyond acquisitions, I would submit that there's been a change in philosophy, and a change in practice. And we are looking at all the ways that we can provide quality support to individuals in the aftermath, not only through hospice, but through other systems as well. It's a much bigger question. And I won't get into sort of all of the details right now, but I think you're absolutely right. And the other lens of our work that I just can't help sort of mentioning in this context is, we look at some of the systems in the aftermath for individuals as vested corporations. And those are corporations who monetarily somehow benefit from the distress or increased distress of an individual, of a newly bereaved individual. And hospice is certainly privatized hospice is one of those vested industries. The funeral industry is another one that we talk about internally, as well as life insurance companies who look to increase a newly bereaved person's distress in order to decrease the compensation payout. So we are looking across a number of different, a number of different systems, a number of different levers. At the end of the day, people need quality support in their communities that has to be accessible, and available to them. And frankly, we also, I believe, need to be doing a better job for the people who are on the front lines, who are serving these individuals, often, with budgets that are duct taped together by the generosity of the people they know or their communities. And so this is where really, if we can reconceptualize what care is offered at the end, and we can apply some of those public dollar pennies towards an infrastructure support that would support local groups doing this work, that's where we need to go. And reduce again those additional cumulative hardships on individuals so that it's hard enough, I think, to lose someone, in your life. We make it so much more difficult for people to cope. And so it's a long game. And we're doing a lot of things right now. The team knows I often talk about pouring concrete. We're pouring concrete now on some infrastructure so that over time we can get the building and then, put the floors in and people can start moving into the different floors and doing work on hospice or, doing work in local communities or rituals. We're hosting some listening sessions with Indigenous nations over the next couple of weeks. I think we have a lot to learn, even from one another, and we have a long way to go when it comes to research and the systems reform. But thank you. That's a great question. And thank you for the work that you do. I know many of you are on the front lines, and it is not easy.
I also saw a question from Natalie about how PCORI supported research includes individuals who have experienced traumatic loss, such as suicide or homicide, since many years. So I think a lot of that, since then you said you continued, since many of them are not connected to a healthcare setting at the time of death. So I think some of my previous answers apply there in terms of interventions, not necessarily being in the context of a healthcare setting, can be part of a PCORI award. And again, screening, some of those issues kind of overlap with previous questions. We do have a large mental health portfolio and did have a targeted topic around trauma. I'm talking a little bit because this is not my day-to-day at my job here. But I think if that was something you wanted to look into, there's two options. One, I am happy to follow up, dig a little deeper on these particular topics. I don't know how much of the study is focused on the bereaved and the aftermath, but something we can kind of dig into the portfolio. We also have a tool on our website. If you go to our website and there's a tab about our research, and if you click on Explore Our Portfolio, you can search many different terms and look at what research we have funded or is currently being funded using many different filters, including just keywords for health areas that you're looking at. So that is one way to just get a quick glance at PCORI funded projects.
Terrific. I have a question that I'd like to ask, and that has to do with that this area is sort of new. There's a small number of projects that have been funded by PCORI. And has PCORI been involved with other new fields of research? And how did that work for those new fields?
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think, sort of a good example that I can provide is our existing efforts in rare disease. So a rare disease, by definition, it affects fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. Now, I know bereavement affects literally everyone eventually, but that means because rare diseases are by definition affect fewer people, there often isn't a lot of research resources for individual rare diseases, and so they don't often have treatments with a body of evidence behind them. And so there are a few ways we try to make it a bit easier to have CER options to compare rare disease, to compare treatments for rare disease. So the comparators, meaning the two options you're comparing in a study, should have some use or underlying evidence of efficacy. So again, the treatment is being used in practice already or has some underlying evidence of efficacy. It does not need to be widespread use or extensive evidence of efficacy, given that we were talking about rare disease. Investigators can propose studies that use comparators that are in use for a similar condition or situation, but need to justify that it's reasonable to use it in this setting. So perhaps there are interventions that are used in other mental health or other health approaches that may be applicable to a bereavement grief space that could be used and justified for that purpose. And they can also do minor adaptations to interventions that have evidence or use in other rare or common conditions that to make them a better fit for a particular condition. So you can say, hey, X works in this population, we adapt for this situation, let's give that a try. That can also be a way we can do that. And so those are some ways we've worked to make a sort of rare disease and other areas where health areas where it's not as much established research and efficacy sort of work in a CER context.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think there are a number of ideas that come up for me as I listen to all of this and thinking about, well, what would I like to compare? And you know, and even thinking from the question list that we had here of people participating, ideas for, you know, like this works for people who have had a loss from a chronic illness. Does it work for people who had a loss from a traumatic cause or suicide or homicide, things like that? So just kind of changing the context and applying something that might have been used and seeing how well that works could be useful. Mm-hmm. I'll look and see if there's other questions. Oh, one just popped up.
I wanted to thank Heidi and Maria for your nice comments. Thank you.
So Stephanie says, for Evermore and all the groups and remarkable folks involved in this work, I'm wondering what is it you'd most like to see done by an average bereaved person like myself who is not specifically connected in their careers to what you all do. So this is a great question about engaging with community, right? So someone who doesn't have a background in research, isn't a medical professional or something, how can they get involved and what is the pathway? How does that work?
So we have many pathways to get involved with PCORI, and there are many pathways as well to get involved with individual research projects. So I think after the webinar, I believe Evermore will be sending some links, and that will include a link to how to get involved with PCORI. So for us as an organization, we have advisory panels for every research program that we fund, including a patient engagement advisory panel. And those are from just people from all different backgrounds and perspectives that belong to our advisory panels and advise the organization on everything we do. We have what's called a PCORI ambassador program, which also is folks who are just interested in CER, PCORI, advancing this kind of engaged research. The PCORI ambassador program is really just a volunteer program. The groups meet, they have coffee talks, they share about their own activities in their local jurisdiction. They also speak on behalf of PCORI at times, and we provide you with information about things that are going on at PCORI and with our research. And then there's individual projects. I think a pathway, people take many different pathways to this work. I myself, like I said, kind of had my own unique kind of pathway for getting involved in the work. But I think getting involved in projects like this, where, I mean, the purpose of this Evermore project is to build community in this space and then potentially leverage those connections and that community into building research and other activities to support the bereaved. And then looking locally at your local health system, your local, if you have a university conducting research or researchers in the space. We now live in a much more virtual world. It doesn't necessarily have to be research taking place in your local community. There may be researchers working in this space. If you find their work interesting and want to contribute, reaching out and building a relationship with them. And also building relationships with other organizations that are working in the space as well. Like I said, I volunteer with a local grief support organization. I'm in Washington, D.C. And so I work with a local nonprofit that provides support services for people who are bereaved. And so get involved that way as well.
Great, thanks. Maybe Joelle has a little something to add as well.
Yeah, and I'll just thank Stephanie for the question. And I think the answer is probably twofold. I would just first say that being here and helping us as we're sort of paving that and throwing that concrete down right now, being able to listen and have feedback from the community at some point. We are talking a lot internally. We've gotten a lot of actual interest in the work that we're doing across the organization. Because there are such significant funding challenges in this field, we're trying to figure out how do we best establish the pipeline and expectations and engage people in a really, in a really practical and good way and use our time in a really good way. I would also just, say that beyond even being here, the work that you've helped us do in the past, Stephanie has been really wonderful in some former advocacy work that we were doing and helped elevate that to some of the most senior levels yeah, no, I mean, so it's hard on us right now because we have a lot coming at us, both from like a content side, and we have people who want to be, engaged, and trying to sort of organize all of this is a challenge. In the email that will come after this, we are starting to have community conversations with people and thinking about how do we structure that maybe to engagement teams. I mean, we're sort of trying to sort of sort this all out like in real time. So it's a little messy. So just I would be so grateful of your grace and patience at this point. But we're actively looking at how do we start braiding in all of the voices and all the experiences in ways that are good use of your time and really move us downfield. So thank you for all that you've done, Stephanie, over the years and following our work and for being here, and everyone else who's here today. This is what it's going to take to facilitate that social transformation that I think we so desperately need.
Thanks, Joelle. And Elizabeth Balser also asks, how can she help with her lived experience of child loss? And I think in these ways that you just described, we have a survey that we'll be sending out. We'll have another opportunity to join a discussion a week from today. And then we have 3 more of these kind of town halls are also additional ways to learn and to get information and be able to kind of engage in a dialogue with us. That would be great. There's a lot to learn from people with all different types of loss, and we can brainstorm other ways that we can outreach, that we can gather the information that people have and the experience they have to identify gaps in a different way. We heard from Sangeeta how they looked at the published research and all the gaps that they identified there. But maybe there's a whole nother universe of gaps that we're not even aware of that we could learn just from talking with people with lived experience. And I think that's a lot of what Joelle has done over the years too in building this organization. I think Are there any more questions that we haven't seen yet? I don't think so. So with that, maybe we'll go ahead and take the next slide. We can maybe end just a little bit early. So in thinking about closing today, I was also cognizant of today being May Day, which is a big day for labor and workers, and there probably are some rallies and things happening as we speak. But I thought about Cesar Chavez, who was the leader of the United Farm Workers for a long time. And one of the quotes that he had was, "From the depth of need and despair, people can work together, can organize themselves to solve their own problems and fill their own needs with dignity and strength." And that really spoke to me and what it's felt like being a part of this project and engaging with people and hearing what they've experienced, and trying to think how we can organize this. This really is social organization. It's community organization that we're doing right now, and it's organized towards a specific goal of research, but research that will eventually help to maybe make life just that much better for people who've suffered a loss. So I thought this was appropriate today for a closing thought. And just a great big thank you to Michelle, to Sangeeta, to Joyal, to Dominique, to everyone who put this together and made this happen. You know, everyone contributed, and it's really been enlightening and very fulfilling to be a part of this. So thank you all.
Thank you, Tom. I loved being part of the conversation, and thank you all.
All right.